The year 1992 was a very complex one in Venezuelan history. That same year, there were two attempted coups, two civic military uprisings as their authors called them, which made their presence felt in the country. The first one was on February 4th and the second on November 27th. But what perhaps no one imagined is that during that second uprising in November, while the Bronco planes were dueling in the skies over Caracas, at the same time a tragedy would unfold in the shadows. That same early morning, under circumstances that remain unclear to this day, numerous inmates from a famous prison in the nation's capital began leaving their cells in what appeared to be a riot, an event that would turn into a deadly massacre that would go down in history, like the massacre at the Retén de Catia, a penitentiary in the west of Caracas, which in the midst of that military attempt ended up witnessing a traumatic story that would raise major questions for the nation. Join us to learn the story of what happened at the Retén de Catia that early morning and morning of November 27, 1992, as well as the mysteries that still remain about it. Reynaldo José Carrillo Vilches here. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to give us great support by liking this video and leaving your comments, which we always read all of them. By turning on notifications with the bell, subscribing to the channel, of course, and sharing this material with all your contacts on WhatsApp, on social media, and anywhere else. So without anything else to add, let's start with today's story. To understand those events in Catia that shocked the Venezuelan psyche at the time, we need to break down the turbulent historical context of Venezuela back then. In 1992, Venezuela was in clear decline. The nation, which in the 60s and 70s was seen as a democratic and prosperous showcase in a region full of dictatorships, had now been sinking for some time into problems of poverty, debt, inflation, violence, and political chaos. The golden years of the so-called Saudi Venezuela under Carlos Andrés Pérez were over, and Venezuela was no longer known as the millionaire of the Americas abroad. Oil revenues financed a state and an economy with more and more burdens, expenses, and commitments that, over time, would become unsustainable. Meanwhile, the machinery of the political parties and the political business elites began to become involved in democratic scandals more frequently. In this sense, during the 1980s, the economic apparatus of the oil democracy began to collapse. The responses of governments like Luis Herrera Campins and Jaime Luchinchi are insufficient to stabilize the increasingly unbalanced economy. Exchange controls, price freezes, devaluations, and unsuccessful negotiations of the foreign debt worsen a severe economic crisis, which is felt through the shortage of basic goods, the loss of purchasing power, and the excessive increase in poverty. It is at this point that, in the 1988 elections, Carlos Andrés Pérez is elected president for the second time, in a country very different from the one he governed in the 1970s. The new government undertakes a series of economic and political reforms known as the Great Turnaround or the Big Package, according to its critics. The main goal of this program was to liberalize and stabilize the country's economy under the guidelines of the International Monetary Fund. And the response to this program was immediate, with a social uprising, encouraged by organizations against the Carlos Andrés government. Riots broke out that later became known as El Caracazo. Beginning on February 27, 1989, it was the start of a war against Carlos Andrés Pérez and the bipartisan system, not only from large sectors of the population, but also from important political and economic groups that began to conspire against him. And in this atmosphere of instability and crisis, the so-called Bolivarian Revolutionary Movement, 200, or Bolivarian Revolutionary Movement 200 for its initials, began to emerge, led among others by then Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez Frias, who, leading a handful of soldiers, tried to seize power through a violent coup d'etat on February 4, 1992. The coup, or military rebellion, failed militarily, but it was a success for the popularity of the leader of the uprising and the emerging movement. This movement, even though many of its leaders were immediately imprisoned, organized in collaboration with the so-called July 5th movement, a new coup attempt planned for the early morning of Friday, November 27, 1992. On the same day, amid the violence shaking the country, the events at the Catia checkpoint would take place. Before continuing the story of this massacre, it's worth asking, what was the Catia checkpoint like and what condition was it in? By November 27, 1992, the Venezuelan prison system was not exactly known for its excellence. It suffered from a large number of problems typical of Latin American prisons, but these also reflected the general situation of the nation. There was severe overcrowding and congestion in the main detention centers. There were multiple cases with delayed legal proceedings. Despite reforms like the 1981 penitentiary regime law, the prison system remained in crisis, including the Catia Detention Center. Officially called the Judicial Internment Center of Los Flores Catia, the Catia Detention Center was a prison facility located in the Sucre parish in the west of Caracas. Built during the government of Raúl León and inaugurated by him in 1966. Its original capacity was for a maximum of 600 inmates, and it was conceived as a prison for those convicted of common crimes. However, over time, and with the progressive increase in population and crime in Venezuela during the democracy, the Catia Detention Center, with the approval of the authorities, began to house all kinds of criminals, and in numbers that exceeded its maximum capacity. So by November 27, 1992, the date of the massacre, the Catia Detention Center held 3,618 inmates, despite a maximum capacity of 600. As we already mentioned, the size and the reputation that this detention center gained earned it the nickname the Monster of the West. The inmates lived in overcrowded conditions, surrounded by excrement and feces, sleeping on the floor and piled up like still living corpses. On some floors, the dirty water leaking from above covered the prisoners' legs. In the detention center's yard, the amount of solid waste and garbage was so great that the area was called Dirty Neighborhood. And perhaps the most significant thing is that the control of the jail or the prison. For a long time now, control was no longer in the hands of the guards or state authorities, but in the hands of the organized gangs that lived there and imposed their law by blood and fire. Drug, arms, and alcohol trafficking were daily life. Meanwhile, violence was omnipresent in the two concrete towers that made up the prison's infrastructure. Only the strongest survived, and the weak had only two options: submit or die. The cells, designed to hold a dozen men, contained up to 50. The lack of hygiene caused diseases to spread. Tuberculosis, diarrhea, and skin infections were the norm, and medical care was a luxury that only a few could get. The prisoners appeared to go there to die slowly. The situation was a ticking time bomb, and the state didn't seem to know how to solve it. So, November 27, 1992, was the day when the gates finally opened at the Catia Detention Center. Just the day before, 3 inmates had been injured when a wall being demolished collapsed and hurt them. This was just one example of the penitentiary's dire state, which was about to face one of its harshest episodes. Let's return to the early morning of November 27, 1992. The members of the July 5th movement associated with the Red Flag Party, together with elements of the armed forces, put their plan into action. At 4:30 in the morning, troops left the fort. Tuna take over the Venezuelan, the television channel, and also seize control of the repeater antennas of Radio Caracas, Television, and Venevisión, channels where they broadcast a pre-recorded message from the imprisoned Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez, calling on the people and the armed forces to join the rebellion. The planned conspiracy was underway. According to the official version at the time, around 5 in the morning, as news of the military uprising was spreading, the prisoners at the Catia detention center began shouting that the government had fallen. And according to the guards at the place, the prisoners started a commotion as they began breaking the cell locks, ready to escape or start a riot with knives and other sharp weapons. Meanwhile, according to other testimonies which have not yet been clarified, it was the guards who began opening the cells, telling the prison population that they were free, giving them the official word about soccer. More from Alberto San Agustin. Even though the exact version may never be known, the truth is that faced with this complex and dangerous situation developing in the prison, the guards at the detention center received explicit orders to close the doors of the administrative units, hide the keys, and take out the shotguns. As the situation gets more and more out of control, with more inmates leaving their cells and calling for an escape, the director of the Catia prison, Eloy Mora, calls units of the National Guard, who arrive and take part in controlling the detention center. While more state security forces were arriving, the inmates tried to escape toward the Guaire River, and according to press reports, some of them succeeded, and this is when the violence begins. Around 485 agents from the Metropolitan Police and the National Guard, carrying 126 firearms, launched an offensive from different points, firing their guns indiscriminately at the prison population inside the detention center. Testimonies say that the climax of the action took place during the morning. That same morning, let's remember, the coup plotters were flying Bronco planes over the capital of Venezuela, bombing the Miraflores Palace and the La Carlota Air Base, throwing the country, especially Caracas, into anxiety and chaos. By then, according to official figures, the actions of the police agents had left 63 dead, 53 wounded, and 28 missing. Although, according to unofficial figures, the death toll may have exceeded 100 or even 200, according to investigations by the technical body of the judicial police, which were carried out later. All these deaths did occur as a result of gunshot wounds. And in several autopsies of the bodies, it was evident that many of these inmates had been killed from behind or from the side. For his part, the attempt by the rebellious military to seize power fails. The rebels surrender around 4 in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the intervention at the detention center continues. Well, between November 28 and 500 members of the National Guard arrived to put an end to the violence inside the prison. Although the official figures were set at 63 dead, as we mentioned earlier, unofficial sources, such as statements from the then governor of the federal district, Antonio Ledesma, suggest that there were actually between 100 and 200 dead, who have never been mentioned. Explanations and theories about the events at the Catia checkpoint have emerged over the years. Ledesma himself argued, although without proof or solid evidence, that those events were closely related to a strategy by the rebels of that November 27th to release more than 3,000 prisoners from the checkpoint, to create anxiety and uncertainty to make it easier to carry out the coup. But this has never been proven. Other theories have suggested that the prisoners took advantage of the situation during the coup, and whether with complicity or not, with or without guard help, they tried to escape from a prison with hellish conditions. Whatever the case, on November 27th, the monster of the West claimed the lives of a large number of people in events that, to this day, have not been fully clarified, and in which the Venezuelan state itself described its response to these events as disproportionate. But after these events, what happened to those involved? The reality is that the events at the detention center were quickly covered by the dust of indifference, and those responsible for that shooting never faced justice. The country was going through a situation that allowed those events, their perpetrators, and the victims to be forgotten in the Venezuelan judicial system and ignored by Venezuelan politics, which had other priorities and directions. The internal conditions of the detention center, despite that massacre, remained the same as before. It wasn't until the visit of Pope Juan Pablo II in 1996 that the Venezuelan authorities were forced to acknowledge the horror of what had happened. On February 9th of that year, the pontiff made a strong appeal to the Venezuelan authorities to respect the human rights and dignity of the inmates. The Pope's words reignited the debate, leading to an agreement to demolish the detention center during Rafael Caldera's government. In this way, the demolition was carried out on March 16, 1997 at 2:55 in the afternoon when the president pressed the button that activated it. The explosives brought down that place, which was considered hell on earth itself. However, by that year, the situation in the rest of the country's penitentiary centers was very similar to that of the now demolished monster of the West. The massacre at Catia's holding facility reflected the nation's troubled times and showed the penitentiary system was failing its main goals of helping to curb crime and of giving fair and dignified treatment to everyone who ends up trapped in that system. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I want to remind you that your support gives us a big boost and is a great help by interacting with the channel, leaving your comments, liking the videos, sharing the content on social media, on WhatsApp, and in any other space. And by turning on the notification bell so you get notified every time we publish new content. So thank you all again, and may God bless you.